I ended the last talk talking about epistemic privilege. And that's the idea that some people are in a position of having access to knowledge that others are not. And the feminist idea is that women, as a historically oppressed and disadvantaged group, uh, is able to see things from a perspective that the oppressor or people who are historically advantaged just cannot see. Now, uh, there's two aspects to epistemic privilege. One being that it's descriptive. It describes the epistemic advantages that oppressed groups have. And by the way, we can even this is also applicable to race, and certainly white women are more historically privileged than black women, and so that would give black women an epistemic privilege as well. So doesn't have to just split along the gender lines. So but just it describes people as being epistemically privileged, and we can see that in action when we think about the contribution that these female psychologists made to the field by criticizing their male counterpart. But beyond being descriptive, it's also prescriptive. If we accept the idea that some people are epistemically privileged, then it follows that we ought to include a diverse group when making decisions, because otherwise we'll have a biased viewpoint. It seems pretty clear. One example I can think of is that I've done a volunteer work for a community orchard. And this group bought this land for $1 from the city because it was infested with blackberry bushes, and it became a place where a lot of homeless people did drugs, and they wanted to beautify it. So they practically gave it to this group, and we through grants and through just the work of community members transformed this whole place, and it looks absolutely beautiful. But then, one day they're giving tours to people who are interested in getting engaged and so on. And they found out right away, when they gave a tour to somebody who was in a wheelchair, that the orchard, as great as it was not, set up for people with wheelchairs. They couldn't access it. But it took that person, coming from that disadvantaged perspective to help shed light on how to make that orchard better. And so, the orchard would have been better from the beginning if we had, included people with disabilities into the planning of the whole thing. So the important thing is to get a diverse group whenever decisions are being made. And that includes, it's from the argument of epistemic privilege that we have to get female lawmakers who are contributing and giving perspective to laws as they're being written and as they're being passed. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about now is ethics. We're going to go back to ethics, but from a feminist standpoint. And I'm going to start it the same way I did our discussion of epistemology, with the subject of a male psychologist. And this time it's Lawrence Kohlberg. And he set out to study the moral development of people. And he made the same mistake that Perry made. He selected a group of males to study and developed a theory of morality that essentially tells the story of Western philosophical thoughts on morality. But here's how his stages go. We have level 1. They're split up into 3 different levels. And this is the pre-conventional. Okay. And in level 1, we have 1, obedience and punishment orientation. Okay, and that's where in terms of thinking what's right and wrong, the child, this is the very first stage, is thinking in terms of how do I not get punished? How do I avoid punishment? So power is of the utmost importance. And what's good is what the person with power says is good. Okay, and then that goes to a self-interest orientation. Okay, and that's where the person starts thinking, well, what's in it for me? Okay, so it's not just about avoiding punishment. It's about what's good is in my own best self-interest. Okay, then we go to level 2, which is conventional morality. And 3, interpersonal accord and conformity. Okay, so now you're a bit older and your moral ideas are developing, and so it's not just about yourself, you are also concerned about other people. So what is good is what's in the best interests, what pleases other people, what helps them. Okay, and so at this stage we start to adopt stereotypical and traditional ways of behaving. Okay, without really questioning that. Okay. And then 4 is authority and social order orientation. So now you're old enough to start learning about laws and what keeps a community orderly. And so what's good is what the authorities say are good, what the police say are good, what the lawmakers say are good, what the judges say are good. So we are concerned at this stage with authority, law, and order. Okay, so you respect authority and you obey laws. And that's why it's a conventional stage of morality. It's because you adhere to the conventions of your community. Well, then we get level 3, which is post-conventional. And here we have number 5, a social contract orientation. And we've, of course, studied this, but the idea is that there are moral principles that are valid in and of themselves. So we don't accept a moral principle because we're asked to. We accept a moral principle because it appears to be justified when we evaluate it. So John Locke is a social contract theorist. We accept the idea that people have inalienable rights because that seems to get it right. And so it doesn't matter so much about what your community says. If your community violates someone's inalienable rights, you have a right to rebel against it. So it's a post-conventional moral idea because it transcends your community. Okay, and then 6 is universal ethical principles. Okay, and that's where you accept basic moral principles, as we have talked about, ethical principles as abstract and universal. So it's not just about the social contract or how one ought to to live among others, but it has to do with universal, abstract laws that you ought to obey. So deontology is a great example. The categorical imperative is thought to be a universal ethical principle. Okay, so as I noted at the beginning, Kohlberg makes the same mistake that Perry makes. He develops this model based on the study of males. So a person who is studying with him, Carol Gilligan, brings the female perspective and recognizes the shortcomings of his argument. So Carol Gilligan is a psychologist herself, and studies women to see how they develop in their moral thinking. And she developed a moral theory known as care ethics. Okay. She recognized that in every stage of Kohlberg's theory, there was a justice orientation. Okay, that there's an application of rules. There's a minimal role for feelings and emotions. We don't talk about feelings and emotions when we talk about all those stages that Kohlberg talked about. So the traditional sort of male approach to ethics is a justice orientation, which has to do with rules, applying rules. We see it in utilitarianism. Do that which maximizes happiness in the world. That's the rule that you need to abide by. In deontology, never treat another person as a mere means to an end. That is the rule that you ought to abide by. In the conventional stages, do what is legal, is a rule. It's always a justice orientation. Even in the pre-conventional stages, we see act according to your self-interest. That's sort of the rule that they're abiding by. And there's no role for feelings and emotions. And there's a sort of a social isolation to it. Each person is an ethical actor who needs to evaluate the morality and act according to the established rule that they accept. She, through studying women, recognizes that women do rely on their feelings and emotions at times when thinking about what they ought to do, and they come from the care orientation. Women often find themselves in a place of having to care for others. Women are often raising the children. They're working the daycare centers. They're the nurses. They often find themselves in a caregiving role, and that affects how they. It has to do with how they think about morality. So what's different? Instead of abiding by rules, the care orientation seeks compromise. Okay, so there's more focus on finding compromise because the person who's oriented by care is trying to keep a community connected, and that isn't achieved by setting a rule and abiding by it in all cases. It's about seeking compromise to keep members who are all connected, who are not socially isolated, connected with one another. There is an appeal to emotions and feelings. They are never discounted. There's a role for sympathy, love, and concern when you come from the care approach. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean a raw emotion where someone's sort of out of control or has no limits or isn't able to control themselves. They're just moved by emotion. No, when she talks about care ethics, she's talking about one reflecting upon their feelings and their emotions, meaning they have a role to play. It doesn't mean that you're completely at the mercy or will of them. And the care orientation always recognizes that no one is socially isolated. There's always a network of relationships with other people, and we should encourage close attachments to one's group. Okay, so those are some important differences. Rules are much less important from the care orientation than they are for the justice orientation. Now, Carol Gilligan is not saying that one ought to always be oriented, through a caring approach. There is a place and a justification for following and establishing rules, and women often, abide by moral principles and rules just as men do. But she makes the argument that the care orientation is lost in the history of philosophy and moral thinking, and it is as legitimate a moral theory and orientation as any of the justice approaches.